On June 18, 1983, Dr. Sally Ride became the first American woman in space aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. 9 years later, on September 12th in 1992, Dr. Mae Jemison became the first black woman in space aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Then, 7 months after that, on April 8th, 1993, Dr. Ellen Ochoa became the first Hispanic woman in space aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery. Now, they didn't get there alone. They got there because of 3 women that most people have never ever heard of. 3 women who worked in 3 different fields in 3 different decades and never met each other. But their work was connected. And without them, Sally Ride, Mae Jemison, and Ellen Ochoa would never have made history. It's Women's History Month. Let me tell you about Hedy Lamarr, Edith Clarke, and Mary Golda Ross. In the 1940s Hollywood, Hedy Lamarr was everywhere. She was on magazine covers, she was at movie premieres, she was called the most beautiful woman in the world. But what people don't know was that after working 12, 15-hour days at MGM Studios, Hedy would skip the Hollywood parties. Instead, she'd sit at her inventing table at home. Because Hedy Lamarr wasn't just an actress, she was an inventor. She was born Hedwig Eva Kaiser in 1914 in Vienna, Austria, into a well-to-do Jewish family. Her father was a bank director who loved understanding how things work. So he would take young Hedy through the city, and then he'd explain the inner working of how machines worked, printing presses, streetcars, and engines. When Hedy was 5 years old, she took apart her own music box just to figure out how it worked, and then she would figure out how to put it back together. That curiosity never left her. By the late 1930s, Hedy fled Austria. The Nazis had taken over, and as a Jewish woman, she wasn't safe. She escaped an unhappy marriage to Fritz Mandl, an Austrian arms dealer called Austria's Merchant of Death. Now, he sold munitions to the Nazis and fascist Italy, and he kept Hedy isolated and treated her like a trophy. But he made one mistake. He would let her sit in on his business meetings with Nazi military leaders, meetings where they discussed weapon systems, submarines, remote-controlled torpedoes, radio guidance technology. And Mandel wouldn't let her speak, but he couldn't stop her from listening. And Hedy absorbed everything. Every technical detail, every vulnerability in the weapons systems, knowledge that could have helped defeat the very enemy her husband was arming. That is, if anyone had listened. Well, she arrived in Hollywood in 1937 and became a star almost overnight. But she couldn't stop thinking about the war. She said, "I didn't feel very comfortable sitting there in Hollywood and making lots of money while things were in such a state." So she started tinkering with an idea. Now, here's the problem. The problem she'd heard Nazi officers discuss in her husband's meetings. The Allies were developing a radio-controlled torpedo. These were torpedoes you could guide to their target using radio signals. But the enemy knew how to jam those signals, practically making them useless. Now, Hedy knew this because she had been sat there in the rooms where Nazi leaders talked about how to jam those Allied torpedoes. And she saw a solution. What if the radio signal didn't stay on just one frequency? What if it hopped from frequency to frequency so fast that the enemy couldn't jam it? The transmitter and the receiver would hop together synchronized like 2-player pianos playing the same song. So she decided to partner with composer George Antheil, a guy who'd written experimental music for synchronized piano players. She told him, "I know a good idea about new munitions and various secret weapons." Together, they built a working prototype, and they called it a secret communications system, and they got a patent for it in August in 1942. Then they offered the invention to the U.S. Navy. But the Navy said no. Not just no. They seized the patent and classified it as top secret. They considered Hedy an alien with ties to foreign adversarial power because she was an Austrian and not yet a U.S. citizen. They told her that the system was too heavy to fit inside a torpedo. They suggested that she'd be more useful selling bonds and kissing soldiers. So, that's what she did. In 1942, she raised $17 million for the war effort with 680 kisses at $25,000 each. Meanwhile, her invention, built from knowledge she learned in Nazi weapons meetings, it sat in a file cabinet. Hedy kept making movies. Her biggest hit was Samson and Delilah in 1949, but by the 50s her career was fading, and MGM did not renew her contract, and she made her last film in 1958. In 1959, her patent expired. 17 years after it was granted, it was now worthless. And then in 1962, 3 years after the patent expired, the U.S. Navy finally used frequency hopping technology during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then when Hedy found out that the military was using her invention, she tried to get some compensation. But the Navy told her they didn't start using it until after the patent expired, so she had no claim. She didn't realize that she could have sued because nobody told her. Now, by the mid-1960s, Hedy was broke. She couldn't pay her utility bills. She often went hungry, except for when friends and family gave her food. She once made $7 million. And now at this point, she was living on $48 a week pension. She spent her final years living quietly in Florida, alone. And in 1997, at the age of 83, she finally received recognition. From the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they gave her and Antheil the Pioneer Award for their invention. She died 3 years later, in January of 2000, at the age of 85. By then, frequency hopping became the foundation for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. The technology she had invented in the 40s was everywhere. It was in every phone, every laptop, every wireless device. Now, the current estimated value of this technology today is $30 billion. Hedy never saw or received a penny of it. In 2014, 14 years after her death, she was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Now, Hedy Lamarr had the knowledge, she had the invention, and she had the patent, but she didn't have the one thing that mattered. They didn't believe her. I don't know, maybe because she was a woman, because she was an actress, because she was Austrian. Well, Edith Clarke faced the same problem, except Edith had something Hedy didn't. She had an MIT degree, but she still couldn't get a job. In 1919, Edith Clarke became the first woman to earn a master's degree in electrical engineering from MIT, one of the most prestigious schools in the world. She had the credentials, she had the knowledge, she had proven herself, but she couldn't get hired as an engineer. Now, Edith was born in 1883 in Maryland, one of 9 children. And when she was 7, her father died, and when she was 12, she lost her mother. She was raised by her older sister and an uncle. She used a small inheritance she received from her parents' death to go to Vassar College, where she studied mathematics and astronomy. And after college, she taught math for a while, and she hated it. All she wanted to do was engineering. And in 1912, she got a job at AT&T, not as an engineer, but as a computer. And that's what they called women who did mathematical calculations by hand, human calculators. She worked for male engineers solving their equations while they got all the credit. At night, she studied electrical engineering at Columbia University. And in 1918, she enrolled at MIT. The following year, she graduated in 1919. She became the first woman to earn a master's degree in electrical engineering. Now, even with an MIT engineering degree, she still couldn't get hired as an engineer. General Electric hired her working back with the computers, this time supervising them. She was vastly overqualified, and she wasn't allowed to do any engineering work, and she earned less money than the men doing the same job. She was put in a lower professional status, even with an MIT degree. She hated teaching math, but in 1921, frustrated, she left the country to go teach physics at Constantinople's Women's College in Turkey. At least there, she would teach. And when her contract ended a year later, she spent 4 months traveling throughout Europe to Austria, Germany, Holland, England. When she came back to the United States in 1922, General Electric had changed their mind, and they offered her what she had wanted all along, an actual engineering position. She became the first professional female electrical engineer in the United States, and it had only taken 10 years. 10 years of proving herself. 10 years of being told she wasn't good enough, even with an MIT degree. And in 1926, Edith became the first woman to present a paper to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers. The paper was called Steady State Stability in Transmission Systems. Now, at the time, transmission lines were getting longer and longer lines meant greater loads and more chances for system instability. The mathematical models available at the time only worked for small systems. Edith's paper provided a model that applied to large systems. It was critical for the growth of the U.S. electric grid in the 20s and the 1930s. In 1930, she became head of the engineers at GE, studying power stability. She worked on an electrical design for the Hoover Dam and other hydroelectrical systems across the West, developing the turbine systems that turned water into power, into electricity. And then between 1923 and 1945, she published 18 technical papers. 2 of them won awards from the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, the Best Regional Paper Prize in 1932 and the Best National Paper Prize in 1941. And then in 1943, she wrote the textbook that power engineers used for decades, the Circuit Analysis of AC Power Systems. It was based on her lectures at GE Engineers. Volume 1 was published in 1943, and Volume 2 was published in 1950. Now, she didn't just do good work. She became the standard. And in 1945, she retired from General Electric and bought a farm out in Maryland. 2 years later, she changed her mind. And in 1947, she became the first woman professor of electrical engineering in the United States when she joined the University of Texas at Austin. So she taught for another 10 years, and then she finally decided to retire for good in 1956. In 1948, she became a fellow of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, the first woman to ever receive that honor. Now, Edith passed away in 1959, but today, the U.S. Department of Energy calls her the smart grid's founding mother. Edith said it herself when she said, "There's no demand for women engineers, as such as there is for women doctors, but There's always a demand for anyone who can do a good piece of work. So she did good work for 40 years until they couldn't ignore her anymore. Now, Edith Clarke spent decades proving she could do the work, proving she belonged, proving that an MIT degree in a woman's hands was worth just as much as one in a man's hand. She proved it, and they finally listened. But what happens when you're not the only woman in the room? You're also the only person who looks like you. Now, Mary Golda Ross didn't just walk into rooms where she was the only woman. She walked into rooms where she was the only woman and the only Native American. And she stayed there for over 30 years. Now, Mary was born in 1908 in Park Hill, Oklahoma, in the Cherokee Nation. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Principal Chief John Ross, who had led the Cherokee people during the Trail of Tears. That was the forced removal of Cherokee from their natural ancestral lands in the southeast to Oklahoma back in 1838. Now, the U.S. government rounded up 16,000 Cherokee at gunpoint, held them in camps, then forced them to march over 1,000 miles in winter. 4,000 died from exposure, starvation, and disease. That was Mary's legacy: survival, leadership, and resilience. Now, in the Cherokee culture, education was valued equally between boys and girls, and Mary's family expected her to go to college, which she did. She was the only girl in her math class, but she didn't care. She said it herself. Math, chemistry, and physics were more fun to study than any other subject. And then in 1928, she graduated from Northeastern State Teachers College with a degree in mathematics. That was a school that was built on the grounds of the Cherokee Female Seminary, a school her ancestor has helped establish. Then, in 1938, she earned her master's degree in mathematics from Colorado State Teachers College, and she took every astronomy class she could. Unfortunately, this was during the Great Depression, and jobs were scarce. So Mary taught math and science in rural Oklahoma schools for 14 years. Then, in 1942, everything changed. World War II was ramping up. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation needed mathematicians. So Mary applied, and they hired her as a mathematical research assistant. She was assigned to the Advanced Development Project Division, which would later become famous and known as the Skunk Works. Now, she worked on the P-58 Lightning. That's the first military plane to fly over 400 miles per hour. She did the calculations using a pencil, a slide rule, and a Friedan mathematical calculator. And when the war ended, as we know, most women at Lockheed and everywhere were laid off, except Mary. Lockheed decided to keep Mary. And they didn't just keep her. They saw something in her. They saw her iron, her technical skill, and they knew she was an asset worth investing in. So they sent her to UCLA to study mathematical and aerospace engineering in 1949. She became a registered professional engineer. She was the first known Native American woman engineer in the United States. Now, this was rare. It was actually almost unheard of. A woman, a Native American woman, being kept after the war and then being sent off for more education, actually being invested in. Lockheed saw her potential, and they bet on it. And in 1952, she became one of the 40 founding engineers of the Skunk Works, the only woman and the only Native American. Now, most of her work was classified, and she worked on the Polaris submarine launched ballistic missiles. She worked on the Agena rocket, which was critical for NASA's Gemini missions. She worked on preliminary designs for flyby missions to Venus and Mars. She co-authored NASA's Planetary Flight Handbook, Volume 3. And in the late 1960s, she was promoted to Senior Advanced Systems Staff Engineer. Now, most of her work is still classified today. And a relative said, if so much of her work had not been classified, she would have won a Nobel Prize. Now, although Mary said it completely differently, she said, what I really want to do was be the woman behind the first woman in space. And she did that. She retired from Lockheed in 1973 after 31 years. But she didn't stop working. She spent the rest of her life supporting the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, encouraging Native American girls to go into STEM fields. And in 2004, at the age of 96, she attended the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. She wore traditional Cherokee dress for the first time in her life, a green calico dress made by her niece. And she was part of a procession of 25,000 Native Americans walking to the museum. When she passed in 2008, she left a $400,000 endowment to the museum. And in 2019, the U.S. Mint issued a Native American $1 coin featuring her image. Now, Mary Golda Ross, the only woman, the only Native American for 30 years, and she never left. 3 women in 3 different fields, 3 different decades. Hedy Lamarr never met Edith Clarke. Edith Clarke never met Mary Golda Ross. And Mary Golda Ross never met Hedy Lamarr. But their work was so connected. Hedy invented frequency hopping in 1942, the technology that kept radio signals from being jammed and then by the 1960s, that technology was being used to secure communications from ground control to satellites, between mission control and the spacecraft. Her invention, the one the Navy told her was too heavy, the one they classified and ignored because became the foundation of how we talk to things in space. Now, Edith spent decades making sure the power grid was stable and reliable. And in the 20s and 30s, she was solving problems that would let electricity travel long distance without failing. Mission Control Center, rocket launch facilities, massive electrical systems required to get something into orbit. That doesn't work without a stable power grid. Edith built that grid. Now, Mary's work at Skunk Works was classified. She worked on ballistic missiles. She worked on the Agena rocket, and that made the Gemini program possible. She worked on preliminary designs for missions to Venus and Mars. She co-authored the Planetary Flight Handbook. She did the calculations that helped us figure out how to leave Earth's orbit and to reach other planets. Hedy made sure we could talk to the spacecraft. Edith made sure we had the power to launch it, and Mary helped us figure out where it was going. 3 women, 3 different fields, in 3 different decades, and their work was connected. Dr. Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. Dr. Mae Jemison became the first Black woman in space, and Dr. Ellen Ochoa became the first Hispanic woman in space. They didn't get there alone. They got there because of Hedy, Edith, and Mary. You build for the people who come after you, not because they'll remember your name, but because the work matters. Now, I talk a lot about the cash system. It's a framework I built around what it takes to stay in the middle when the odds are stacked against you, when you're the only one in the room, and when they don't believe you and they tell you no. Cash is shoot, attach, stay, and heart. These three women are great examples of how it works. Shoot is about seeing the problem no one else sees. It's about preparation. It's about knowing what you're walking into before the gate even opens. Hedy Lamarr saw a problem in 1942 that no one else could see. She sat in those business meetings with Nazi military leaders. She'd absorbed how weapon systems worked. She knew Allied torpedoes could be jammed. She built a solution 20 years ahead of its time. She saw what was coming. That's shoot. Now, attach is about mastering your craft so completely that they can't ignore you. It's about becoming the standard. Now, Edith Clarke didn't just do good work. She became the standard. For 40 years, she wrote the textbook, literally. She won the awards. She presented the papers. She solved the problems no one else could solve. They couldn't ignore her anymore. That's attach. Now, stay is about the endurance. It's about showing up. It's about not leaving when it gets hard. Mary Golda Ross walked into rooms where she was the only woman and the only Native American. For 30 years, she didn't leave. She stayed. That's the stay. Now, heart is building something bigger than yourself. It's about the people who will come after you. Hedy, Edith, and Mary. Three women who changed the world. And most people have never heard their names until now. If you want to learn more about the cash system and the pre-ride checklist and how to navigate through male-dominated industries as an outlier, go to the 8secondlife.com. I'm Shar, everybody. Thank you for watching. And if these women's stories resonated with you, share it with another outlier who needs to hear it. Because we can't ride alone. Stay in the middle. Thank you.